focuses on using Her lab focuses on using artificial intelligence and digital technologies to better understand and treat psychiatric disorders, particularly psychosis. Aarush Mehta is a sophomore and pre-med at Stony Brook University. He's been working on sentiment analysis in Tang's lab since he was a high school student. Amir Nikzad is a postdoctoral fellow at Zucker Hillside Hospital. His interests are primarily in studying the structure of clinical speech at the syntax-semantics interface. Yan Tong is a linguist with expertise in pragmatics and computational linguistics. She recently completed her postdoc with the Tang Lab and is now an assistant professor of linguistics at Purdue University. And finally, Zak Singh is a computer scientist with expertise in machine learning, particularly reinforcement learning. He has worked with the Tang Lab as a research fellow since 2022 and has just relocated back to Cambridge, England to complete his PhD. And thank you so much. And Sunny, if you want, we can start. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction to Che, and thank you all for being here with us. Here, let me do my, I think we're with the new Zoom. Yeah, with the new Zoom share, I have trouble sharing the right PowerPoint screen, actually. Does anybody know a trick around that? It doesn't let me pick between the different PowerPoint streams anymore. But perhaps I'll just share my other desktop. Okay, is that showing up okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Right.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you all for being here. And oh, there we are. Thank you all for being here today. So we're continuing our seminar series of this year, which is themed around a set of publications in the discourse themed issue from Schizophrenia Bulletin earlier this year. And so our publication was on looking at latent factors of speech and language disturbance in schizophrenia. So, of course, I'd like to thank the incredible team that's been a part of all of this work. We couldn't have done it without them. In particular, my co-presenters today, Aarush, Amir, Yan, and Zak, some of whom really went through a lot of trouble to be here today. Yan is still recovering from COVID, and Zak just relocated across the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm really grateful that they're with us and presenting with me today. So for the talk today, it's really going to be in two parts. The first part, we're going to be presenting the results of our paper from Schizophrenia Bulletin, which looked at identifying and validating latent factors of speech and language disturbance. And then for the second part of our talk, I wanted to share with you some new avenues of investigation that we've started to pursue since the publication and since we worked on that paper. Modeling these latent factors with various computational methods. So without further ado, I'm going to start out by jumping into the exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis part of this project. So why, by latent factors, I'm referring to the concept that there are some distinct organizing constructs potentially going across individual thought, language, and communication symptoms. And so why should we be interested in this in the first place? Well, I think I could probably say without much controversy that one of the major goals of computational research in language and in psychosis is the idea that we want to achieve some sort of objective quantification of speech-related changes in psychosis that can then be related to clinical outcomes that are important. But it's actually when I set about trying to accomplish this, it wasn't clear to me exactly the best way to pursue this actually. And there are several options, all of which are meritorious in their own ways. I think many of the groups have used diagnosis as the clinical outcome to model with speech features. But as we all know, psychosis is a heterogeneous disorder. And if we're lumping together people who may be, predominantly negative symptoms and have negative thought disorder with people who are very actively psychotic and are even more on the manic side, then we might be, there might be some signals that are being averaged out in the wash. We can also approach this issue by looking at individual symptoms like incoherence, tangentiality, circumstantiality, derailment, etc. But here there are many overlapping and co-occurring entities. So if we're thinking about it from a computational perspective, it doesn't seem quite efficient or realistic to model each of these individual symptoms separately from one another. We can also go direct to the clinical outcome. So we can look at clinical outcomes like development of full-blown psychosis in people with high risk or relapsed or other really meaningful targets like that. And that could be a really meaningful way of looking at this. But currently, we're still limited in most studies and in most sites by relatively small samples. So, the limitation of that approach is that if we go directly to clinical outcomes, there could be spurious findings, that we can't otherwise disentangle. So that's why I thought that we felt that identifying latent factors behind clinical observations of speech and language disturbance could kind of be a middle ground between looking at individual symptoms. So it adds a little bit of potential validity, and between that and directly looking at clinical outcomes or diagnosis. And for the latent factors to be meaningful in this context, the requirements are that they must have a distinct clinical significance among the different factors. They have to be suitable for computational modeling using distinct strategies. So it must be possible and logical to look at the different factors in different ways from a computational perspective. And the latent factors should be valid both within psychosis as well as cross-diagnostically, because thought disorder is more and more recognized as a dimensional construct that's not specific only to schizophrenia or only to psychosis. And so when looking at the background before we got started in this project, which is actually going on more like 2 years ago at this point, there were a lot of really interesting clinical scales, but there was just an almost overwhelming myriad of speech-related symptoms that were characterized by these scales. And so that was a little too much. It was a little bit of a Goldilocks problem. That was too much. And looking at a single diagnosis kind of seemed like we would be putting too much in the same bucket. The other really strongly validated way of organizing thought disorder type symptoms was looking at kind of a positive dimension and a negative dimension. So like disorganization and underproductivity or impoverishment. But then it seems like disorganization was perhaps grouping too many symptoms together as well. And other thought disorder factor solutions were kind of idiosyncratic and didn't seem like they were well replicated across samples. Actually, if Frederica Stein, who's a part of Discourse, published a paper after we got started in this project that came up with a really interesting 3-factor solution that I'll discuss in relation to our project as well. I think if I had seen that, I might have just used hers, but it wasn't available at the time when we got started. So in terms of the overall approach to our project, we had a larger cross-diagnostic sample of 343 participants, which included a schizophrenia subsample of 90 participants. So we used clinical ratings for thought disorder items or speech and language disturbance items in these groups. And first, we pursued an exploratory factor analysis in the cross-diagnostic sample. And then we validated this with a confirmatory factor analysis in the same sample, and then checked whether or not this factor structure applied in the schizophrenia subsample as well. And then we related the factors to computational features as well as clinical features in the cross-diagnostic sample, as well as in the schizophrenia subsample on its own. First I'll jump into the discovery or the validation of the factors themselves. So here's the breakdown of the participants. We had 76 healthy volunteers, 130 people with other psychiatric disorders like mood disorders, anxiety disorders, etc. 47 people with other or undetermined psychosis. So these were people who either had mood-related psychotic disorders or were generally thought to be psychotic, but we weren't, but the clinical procedures that we followed didn't allow for detailed like SCID diagnosis or anything like that. So we put them in a separate group. And then we had 90 participants with schizophrenia spectrum disorders that were, really verified, giving us our total sample of 343. And as a limitation, there were, as you might expect, gender imbalances with more males in the schizophrenia sample and more women in the other psychiatric disorders, as well as differences in race. And the overall level of speech and language disturbances were different, as you might expect, with the highest levels in both of the psychotic groups, an intermediate level in other psychotic disorders, and very low levels in healthy volunteers, as you'd expect. So in terms of the clinical ratings that went into our analysis, we used the Thought, Language, and Communication Disorder scale from Nancy Andreasen as the basis because it seemed to, there's some redundancy, but it seemed to cover, I wanted to span the space of potential speech and language disturbances as much as I could. And it had a nice breadth, and it was, a very highly utilized scale in this area. And we were interested more in speech and language in general, and not particularly in thought disorder per se. So we also added 2 items from the SANS that weren't covered in the TLC that described speech changes. So specifically increased latency and decreased vocal inflections. So out of those total of 20 items, we included 14 items into the analysis because there were 6 items that were very rare. So they occurred in less than 5 or 10% of our sample. And for that reason, they were difficult to rate in a consistent basis. The 14 items that were included, we were able to achieve interrater correlations of over 0.9. So when we looked at the exploratory factor analysis, it made the labels here are a mistake, sorry. On the left, there was a 2-factor solution that made sense. And on the right, there was a 3-factor solution that made sense as well. So the 2-factor solution was no big surprise. It split the items on like a positive versus negative or disorganized versus impoverishment or underproductivity type of split. Whereas the 3-factor solution further divided the disorganized item, the factor that we would have expected. So here are those factors again in a little bit more detail. Specifically, we see that one of the factors that came from the bigger disorganized category included items like tangentiality very highly, circumstantiality, derailment, pressured speech, items like that. So we labeled it inefficient speech because it was about speech that didn't quite hang together to the topic at large. Whereas the other disorganized factor included ratings like incoherence, illogicality, and neologisms, loss of goal, etc. So here we termed that incoherent speech. So speech where it was hard to understand the message being delivered. And interestingly, there were some some cross-loaded items, which to me also made sense intuitively and clinically. So poverty of speech is both inefficient as well as incoherent, along with derailment and loss of goal. So those were the factors that we found in our exploratory factor analysis, and we moved on to confirmatory factor analyses to kind of validate what we found. So first, in the cross-diagnostic sample, the two-factor solution did not do very well. And for the three-factor solution, because of the cross-loaded items and the technicalities of the confirmatory factor analysis approach, you have to choose to either, you weren't allowed to cross-load items on two different factors. So we tried it with just excluding the cross-loaded items, as well as adding a separate factor with just the cross-loaded items to test the three-factor solution. And there we found actually surprisingly good fit indices for both of those ways of looking at the three-factor solution. So we did the same kind of tests in the schizophrenia subsample as well. So those 90 participants who had verified schizophrenia diagnoses. And we found more or less the same thing. The two-factor solution did not do very well. Here, the numbers were not quite as impressive for the three-factor solution, but they were pretty good and fairly comparable with other factor solutions that have been proposed in the literature. So as an interim summary, we found that this three-factor solution of looking at inefficiency and incoherence along with impaired expressivity had a good statistical fit for schizophrenia as well as cross-diagnostically. So moving on to the next topic, we looked next at the clinical and computational context for these latent factors. So first, we compared across diagnostic groups. And we found that there were indeed different patterns for these different kinds of speech disturbances. Mainly, impaired expressivity was present across all the diagnoses, but was particularly elevated, and there was an intermediate effect for people with other psychiatric disorders. Similarly, for inefficient speech, this was less common in healthy volunteers, but there was also a significant intermediate effect for people with non-psychotic psychiatric disorders. Whereas for incoherent speech, we found that it was elevated in both the psychosis groups, but almost absent in both healthy volunteers as well as people with other psychiatric disorders. So there was no intermediate effect there. Perhaps implying that incoherent speech per se, as a subset of disorganization, was really more specific to psychosis in particular, whereas inefficiency and impaired expressivity can range more widely across diagnoses and into healthy volunteers. So next, we also wanted to validate the factors from a computational perspective, or perhaps not validate, but we wanted to ask whether or not we could model them distinctly and in a sensible, logical way with computational approaches. So from the same data set, a subset of the same data set, we had open-ended interview items or tasks where we extracted both acoustic information as well as verbatim transcripts. And there we analyzed about 79 total computational features, which we then reduced to 27 features and 9 categories using a variance and frequent analysis to look for items that were not covariate with other items. And broadly, the kinds of features that we were looking at included those involving tempo, pitch, speech quantity, speech errors and disfluencies, lexical characteristics, sentiment, parts of speech, graph features looking at connectivity, as well as measures of cosine embedding distances or semantic similarities. And so we compared the correlations between the speech factors and each of these quantitative speech features. So the figure was too big to put on one slide, so I have 2 of them here, which I can flip back and forth between. So I want to say that this is, this is a reasonable sample size, but still relatively small if we're trying to understand psychosis as a whole, or psychiatric disorders certainly as a whole. So we weren't looking at these relationships with the expectation that they're necessarily going to be generalizable across, like even English, forget like multiple languages. More of what I was looking for was just looking for the idea or the patterns that different factors would have different patterns of associations with different computational features. And we do see that that is the case. So just if you, kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the colors, you can see that there are some factors which are loaded, in opposite directions for different factors. Some other features are correlated with, one kind of disorganization inefficiency, but not incoherence, or vice versa. And we also see there are somewhat different patterns depending on the diagnostic group. So this is the other continuation of those correlations. And here we looked at those same types of associations, but mapped them in a network plot where each of the nodes is either, well, in red, we have the 3 different language disturbance factors. And in the various other colors, we have the different categories of computational speech features. And we wanted to visualize in this kind of global perspective whether or not we saw different kinds of relationships for the 3 different factors. And we do see that this is indeed the case. So impaired expressivity was, close to things like changes in tempo, as well as word errors, like partial, I guess it's going to repeated words over here. Inefficient speech had some relationships to speaking rate in the opposite direction of impaired expressivity, but was also related to positive valence and, parts of speech like subordinating conjunctions. Incoherence actually had the fewest relationships to computational speech features, but was related to parts of speech like adpositions and pitch variability, as well as, I think, valence too. And here is the same kind of representation, but for the schizophrenia subgroup. And here inefficient speech was highly connected to various different kinds of speech disorders, and incoherent speech, again, had the fewest number of connections, significant connections, and impaired expressivity is over here. It was related to type token ratios and mean speaking rate. As another way of thinking about our results, we found when Frederica published her study, I was very excited to see that even though her completely, independent sample and large sample used a totally different language, it was done in German. They used slightly different scales, so SANS and SAPs, which are by the same author, but included some differences in their items. We found actually fairly consistent results. So they also had one, more negative factor with emptiness, which we called impaired expressivity. And they also found a distinction between different kinds of more positive thought disorder or speech and language disturbance symptoms, with incoherence separating out from items like tangentiality and circumstantiality. So as an interim summary, it looks like in addition to having a good statistical fit, our approach may be clinically relevant because we're seeing different patterns. It's likely computationally relevant because we can measure them with different strategies. And looking at the factors in this way also seem to be concordant with results from a large independent study and cross-linguistically. And just briefly, because it looks like I'm taking more time than I'm supposed to, we also connected from a theoretical perspective. We wanted to see if we could connect these latent factors to how we understand the pragmatics of language. So some of you might be familiar with the Gricean maxims. So I'm probably not doing justice to this, but in a very brief summary, I think so. Grice was theorized or proposed that we can understand a successful speech act as a situation where the addressee is made to understand the M intent or the meaning intent of the speaker. and that's the basic act of communication. And in addition to the semantic content of what is being delivered, there are other like implicatures, or there's other pragmatics of speech, or the other context of the speech is also important for understanding this. And there are certain certain assumptions that are made in normal social contexts that makes communication effective and possible. So there's an assumption that the speech is high in quality, so that it's truthful, that a quantity is appropriate, so it's neither more nor less than what is needed. There's an assumption that everything you say is somehow relevant to the intent of what you're trying to communicate, and that the speech is clear. So it's that it's avoiding of obscurity and ambiguity, and that it's orderly. So I think that this kind of understanding could help us distinguish among our factors, latent factors as well. So we can conceptualize impaired expressivity as primarily a problem with quantity, and mainly too little quantity. Whereas the disorganized types of speech factors, inefficiency and incoherence, relate to all three of quantity, relevance, and manner. So inefficiency, particularly associated with too much quantity, irrelevant and unclear. However, I think that to distinguish inefficiency from incoherence, I would say that inefficiency in speech is where the meaning intent is still preserved. So the individual meanings of the utterances are, interpretable. They just don't. They just violate some of the other maxims. Whereas for incoherence, it can violate some of these, but in a way where the meaning intent itself is disrupted, where the addressee is no longer able to understand. From another direction, we also related these latent factors to Barbara Gross's theories on discourse structure. So many of you might be familiar with syntactic trees, which map out the relationship between words and how they create the syntax or the meaning of a sentence. So Barbara Gross's theories proposed a similar kind of structure to discourse as a whole, where you can think of utterances or as discourse segments, which each have their own discourse segment purpose, so the meaning that each segment is meant to convey. And these discourse segments are then hierarchically organized to deliver the overall discourse purpose. So if we think about discourse in this way, then we can separate the ideas of inefficiency and incoherence by thinking of inefficiency as disorganization on the level of how discourse segments are related to the overall discourse purpose. So each segment still conveys its discourse segment purpose, but the way that they're organized for the purpose as a whole is disrupted. Whereas in incoherence, I would conceptualize that as a more local problem in organization, where the relationship between each discourse segment and their individual discourse segment purposes is then disrupted. So anyway, so I think some of you are very much better versed in the theoretical backgrounds than I am. So I'm very interested to hear in the discussion whether this makes sense or whether there are other ways to understand these results as well. So, just adding that to the interim summary here, in addition to a good statistical fit and clinical and computational and cross-study validation, we feel like our results can also be relatable in a sensible way to pragmatic linguistic theories, making these factor scores perhaps at least one potentially valid way of approaching how to understand constructs within speech and language disturbance and schizophrenia. All right, so moving on to let somebody else speak for a moment, Aarush is going to talk about his investigations associating these factor scores with sentiment. Aarush?
Thank you. So the transcripts from the image test were analyzed for sentiments using standardized measures. So we looked at valence, arousal, dominance. These features use nominative ratings from Warner 2013. Each word was rated along these dimensions, with valence describing whether a word was perceived as happy or sad, arousal describing whether it felt excited or calm, and then dominance, whether something was controlling or controlled. We also use a dictionary from Mohammed 2013 to identify some basic emotions. These include like happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. We counted these words that corresponded to each of these features. So we hypothesized that negative emotions would be correlated with latent factors of speech disturbance, particularly with inefficient speech, because there might be more repeated mentions of a negative content. Specifically in sample 1, we found that impaired expressivity was associated with higher positive valence and less fear sentiment. There was a trend between impaired expressivity and higher dominance as well. This is a second data set on the right, and that demonstrates trend level associations between decreased happiness and both incoherence and impaired expressivity. We think that the difference in effects are driven by slight differences in the stimuli that we use in the analysis. So both samples saw the TAT image, the thematic apperception image. Sample 1 also saw a Rorschach image and the cookie theft image, while sample 2 saw 2 alternative versions similar to the cookie theft image. So it could be that those images of the stimuli were less emotionally evocative. Thank you.
Sunny, you're on mute.
Sunny, we cannot hear you.
Sorry. Thanks, Aarush. So next, Amir is going to talk to us about his work modeling latent factors with multidimensional network analysis.
Thanks, Sunny and Aarush. Yes, our next approach to model latent factors was based on a multi-layered semantic speech graph model. Semantically speaking, speech conveys information about states or actions, their participants, and causes or like settings and manners by which they're happening. In the following example on the screen, the dog is now chasing the cat quickly across the street. We have some entities or elements, including dog, chasing, and the cat, that point to the main event and its participants. These elements indicate who does what to whom in a given utterance, and from a semantic representation perspective, they constitute the core of the clause. But there are also other elements that provide information about when, where, and how a given event is happening. In this example, now, quickly, and across the street point to these layers of information. Again, from a semantic representation perspective, these elements constitute the periphery of the clause and provide accessory information to the core. These semantic relations can then be transformed into network representations as visualized in the figures. On the left, chase is connected to the dog and the cat based on the predication relation, and dog is also connected to the cat based on an action relation. On the right, now and street are connected to chase based on the setting relation that marks information about time and location, and quickly is also connected to chase based on relation of manner. Next slide, please. These graph representations can then be quantified in terms of their size, connectedness, and organization. As Natalia Mota has demonstrated, size of graphs can be computationally modeled using number of nodes and edges. Their connectedness can be quantified using largest strongly connected component, which is marked by the orange circle in the upper left figure. A speech graph organization can be modeled by comparing the connectedness of the graphs with randomly generated graphs of the same size, as shown in the upper right figure. Since our approach also allows disconnections within graphs, meaning the subgraphs within a bigger graph, we also use number of connected components as suggested in Caroline's Netekoven's work on semantic graphs, as visualized in the lower figures. In our previous work on action predication graphs, we found that size, connectedness, and organization of semantic graphs convey non-redundant information about psychosis disease dimensions. Now, with this background, our objective was to see whether we can localize the latent factors within semantic domains. To examine this, we followed the following outline. First, we parsed picture description and open-ended journaling samples into their building utterances. Then we extracted semantic elements using a method called semantic role labeling. Then we built semantic graph representations for core and pre-free elements and quantified them, and then assessed relations between latent factors and core versus pre-free graph features. Results were based on samples from 71 participants, 27 with psychosis. Here's the first finding. We can quickly formulate it as disorganization disrupts the core of clause. In other words, it mainly affects the argument predicate structure within utterances. On left, you can see the correlations between core graph features and inefficiency and incoherence factors. Signals are not present in prefrontal graph representations in right. In addition, incoherence and inefficiency show different fingerprints that suggest the potential for their independent modeling using semantic graph features. Finally, we found that, next slide please, we found that impaired expressivity causes a generalized shrinkage in all semantic layers, marked by less number of edges, less node per degrees, and denser graphs in both core and pre-free graph representations.
Thanks, Amir. So next, moving on to a different strategy for modeling these latent factors. Yan's going to talk about her work using semantic coherence generated from large language models.
Many of you are probably already familiar with the idea of embeddings, word embeddings. So just to give you a little bit of background, in this somewhat simplistic example, we can assign similarity values along those dimensions for the words cat, kitten, dog, and houses. And then when we plot their relationships in a space, we can see that cat and kitten are most closely related, and they are more similar to dog than they are to houses. We can also represent the nature of the relationship between words. For example, the relationship between man and woman is recapitulated in the relationship between king and queen. Yeah, so when calculating similarity scores, traditional language models such as GloVe are static. They don't have dynamic context sensitivity. However, recent development of large language models such as BERT and GPT-3 are able to go beyond. So let me give you an example illustrating the contrast between the more recent contextualized language model BERT and the static model GloVe. So here's an example paragraph. The chef put the game pie in the oven. The housekeeper quietly separated the sweet and tart desserts. The maid put the apple tart in the toaster. Outside, space aliens and astronauts loudly shouted, "Game on." And here are the semantic similarities we got using GloVe and BERT. So as you notice in this example paragraph, there are two occurrences of the word game showing up in different positions with slightly different meanings. And similarly for the word tart, tart as in tart desserts as an adjective, and tart as in apple tart as a noun. Although it's the same word, it occurs in different context window. So BERT here gave a similarity score of 0.41 for the two game. In contrast, GloVe simply says the two occurrences are identical and give a similarity of 1, suggesting that GloVe is not sensitive to context. And similarly for the two occurrences of tart, BERT is able to capture this nuance, whereas a static model like GloVe cannot. So our goal here is, is to model latent factors with semantic coherence using large language models, and specifically to compare models and different analytical strategies and investigate how they detect speech and language disturbances. So inspired by a recent publication by Prola and colleagues, we computed similarities between embeddings using contextualized large language models. We adopted strategies where we compared the Spearman correlations between words and sentences embedding vectors. This Spearman metric is based on a recent paper which argues that the representational geometry of contextualized embeddings makes cosine similarity uninformative. And there are many post-processing methods which can correct for this. And one of them is ranking-based statistics, such as Spearman. So that's why we chose Spearman correlation. And specifically, one strategy looks at pairs of words with varying inter-word distances. Another strategy focused on all pairs of words within a certain window, either 5 or 10 words. And the utterance level analysis looked at pairs of either adjacent sentences or skipped one sentence in between. So each of the analytical strategies were applied to 3 different language models, BERT, T5, and Distill GPT-2. There are also 3 levels of pre-processing. We used to clean the transcripts to different degrees, and we designed 13 analytical strategies. So we used picture description tasks, and here is participants' demographic information, and you may notice age, education, it showed significance. Yeah, age and education. Thank you. So this is so some findings here. This is Pearson correlation coefficients between the factors, scores and utterance level similarity measures. And here only significant values are displayed. And there are 3 rows. For the first row, we measured verbatim data sets. And second row is clean without disfluencies. And third row is a clean and no stop words. And a few things to point out here. First, we found effects across language models and across levels of pre-processing, suggesting sensitivity of computational measures in picking up the clinically meaningful factors. And we also found positive correlation between the inefficiency factor and the computational measures, suggesting that when inefficiency increases, utterance level similarities increase. So yeah, different from utterance level, where we found most significance for inefficiency, word level strategies reflect incoherence. And interestingly, moving window 5 showed negative correlation. And as you may notice here, there are more significance in using the K 1 to 10, namely using word-to-word similarity at K interword distances, then using average similarity of each pair of words in a given window. So it looks like K is more effective strategy than moving window. So to sum up, language models, utterance level similarity metrics are associated with inefficiency and impaired expressivity, whereas word level captures a different picture. They are associated with incoherence. We also found the degree of language models word level similarity measures correlation with the TLC factors is sensitive to the degree of cleaning, which due to space limits we couldn't show it. But and also how to interact these results depends on each model's architecture. And yeah, we're open to suggestions for future work. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Yan. So finally, to round out our presentation on how we've been modeling these different latent factors with different strategies, Zak will talk to us about how to predicting speech disturbance factors with fine-tuned large language models.
Thanks, Sunny. So overall, our goal with this is to take these raw patient interview transcripts, pass them through a fine-tuned LLM, and get as outputs our individual factor scores. And right now, we're focusing on inefficiency and incoherence specifically because we think that this is something LLMs are particularly well suited for. So what is fine-tuning? So fine-tuning is a process by which an existing LLM can be tailored to a specific new task. And this doesn't have to be just text generation like we usually see with LLMs. It could be a regression task like automatically grading an essay, it could be classification like grouping documents by topic, or even writing poetry. And the reason why this is so exciting is that it lets us take advantage of the LLM's baseline understanding of language rather than starting from scratch. So it's like teaching a child who can't read yet to write haikus. That's basically impossible. But if you teach an adult who already knows how to read and write, they can follow those rules pretty easily. So fine-tuning only requires a few thousand data points to adapt to a task, rather than tens of millions if you're training from scratch, which makes this approach workable for small data sets, like what we're working with. So a kind of initial model to attempt this is to fine-tune an individual LLM for each factor score. And how that fine-tuning works is we've taken the pre-trained BERT model, appending a fully connected regression layer to the end, and then updating the weights of the entire model end-to-end using the LoRa fine-tuning algorithm. And the benefit with LoRa is that you only update a small, tiny subset of the model's weights. And that lets you run this on commodity hardware. You don't need a massive data center. So on our data set of about 300 patient transcripts, we have our initial results on the right. And you can see that during training, our model is successfully learning to minimize loss. But during evaluation, when dealing with unseen examples, the model quickly plateaus and stops learning. And this problem is known as overfitting in machine learning. And it's caused by it just memorizing the training data. And this usually is caused by model overparameterization. So when you have too big of a network, too powerful a network for your problem domain, or if you have a very imbalanced or small data set. So the usual way we solve overfitting is to reduce the size of the network. But we can't really do that because we're fine-tuning a language model, which is huge, and we can't kind of cut it to pieces and shrink it down. So then our only answer would be to get more and ideally more balanced data. But it's pretty difficult to collect diverse examples of disordered speech in the real world at the kind of scale we need. And to go a little bit more into imbalanced data sets. So it's basically impossible to collect samples covering the entire range of possible severities and combinations. And some TLC scores are exceedingly rare or not present in our training data set. And that makes it very difficult for the network to generalize, because what it could do, for example, is just memorize a handful of symptomatic examples and never otherwise predict high scores, because that minimizes the error of the model overall. And you can see here we're heavily skewed. Oops. We have a few examples of very severe levels of incoherence or tangentiality, etc. So instead of collecting more real data, which is very difficult, we can generate it synthetically. And this would also allow us to balance the training set by generating scores that are not found or very rare in our training data set. So the way we approach this is we took an existing data set of about 1,000 healthy interviews for a picture description task. And then we rewrite them algorithmically to exhibit disordered speech at different levels on the TLC scale. And now this is, of course, limited to any disturbances that are strictly linguistic and can be captured and simulated on the transcripts. So for now, we're working on just a subset. So that's tangentiality, circumstantiality, derailment, incoherence, and logicality. So I'll dive into how we're simulating logicality to give an in-depth example. So we have a number of different transformations we apply, starting with swapping adjectives and adverbs with their antonyms. So most will go down to few, biggest to smallest, that type of thing. We negate sentences randomly in the transcript to create contradictions with previous sentences. We use a customized version of GPT-2 to continue sentences, and we give it only a small context window, which means that it's the text it's generating is likely to contradict things that it hadn't seen earlier in the transcript. Now, we also replace what we call reason clauses, which start with because, since, etc., and conclusion clauses start with therefore, so, with alternatives sampled from our data set. And we also append these clauses onto sentences which didn't have them previously. And now all of these different transformations have a whole bunch of knobs and dials we can turn, the most important being how frequently they're applied. And by turning those dials in specific ways, you can try to align yourself with the TLC scale. So we've created 4 separate configurations of the synthesizer, one for each level. So you simply just plug in your text and the level desired, and you get your output. So for some real examples from our data set, we have this input sentence. It looks like the gender breakdown, what it appears to be is 4 men, a woman, and a girl. And so this is from a picture description task. And then we see it ends, and that's because they're all male, which is pretty contradictory to what was just said and therefore illogical. The next one, there's a table near the pool around which some people are sitting and playing, and it adds, because there is no water, which again, doesn't really make sense. The house seems suburban and quite nice. Therefore, I'm not sure if it's a good place to live. Again, it's contradictory. So besides logicality, we're working on other strategies for incoherence, tangentiality, derailment. So with incoherence, we're looking at deleting coordinating and subordinating conjunctions and adjectival pronouns, replacing pronouns with alternatives from the respective groups. So that way you get kind of pronoun mismatch. We widen pronouns to it, its, itself, and we replace words using masked word prediction via BERT. So that way we get kind of unorthodox word choices shuffled into our sentences. With tangentiality, we're using a custom configured GPT-2 model to elaborate upon sentences from the transcript. And with derailment, we're trying shuffling sentences within the transcript and inserting entire sentences from other transcripts. So how this all would come together is we would mix in our synthetic data into our human-rated interview transcripts. And we would do this in a strategic manner to try to balance the factor score distributions in order to smooth out the training process. So just in brief summary, fine-tuning LLMs to predict speech disturbance factors. It's an exciting idea, but a naive approach is prone to overfitting due to overparameterization of the model. And the fact that these small, imbalanced real-world data sets we're able to collect aren't sufficient in size for training an LLM. So synthetic data generation may prove to be an effective solution to overfitting by increasing the dataset size and improving its balance. But we're still working on this, so the results are pending.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. So that's it for our whirlwind tour of latent factors and what we're doing about them. And maybe I'll just put in a brief plug that we would really appreciate collaborative efforts to get more transcript data to help develop these models. So I'd love to talk to anybody who would be interested in that. Should we open up to questions, Tuche?
Thanks for all these great presentation to the Tang Lab members. I think we can pass to the discussion part. In the discussion, if you have any question, you can raise your virtual hand, or if you want, you can use chat box, and I can read your questions. And I think we can start. And now I saw Lena's question in chat box. We can start with Lena's question. Lena asked, nice talk, Sunny, impressive deal of work and thought. I was wondering about stability of latent factor structure across illness trajectory with clinical symptoms, factor solutions, both numbers and constituents, vary across acute, generally 5 versus chronic, often 3 phases. For example, we rarely see effective factors in established illness, 3 factors. Has this been looked at in your data?
Yeah, quick answer to that, no. That's a really interesting question, and maybe something that we could, as some of you might know, there's an effort across our consortium to collaboratively look at latent factors and how to understand different constructs within thought disorder. So perhaps this is, I mean, it's this is something where it would be particularly beneficial to have a large amount of data spanning across different phases of illness. So no, I haven't done that yet.
Thanks, Sunny. I think Amelie has a question. Please, Amelie, you can.
Yes, I have a few questions. My first question is to the last speaker, and I'm sorry I already forgot the names of everybody. But I was wondering how you decided on what modifications to apply. So was there a theoretical basis to simulate the illogicality or the different other aspect? What made you choose these specific modifications?
Yeah, so we looked at the definitions provided by the TLC scale, specifically as to what they suggest to look for. And then we looked at our own data as well, and looked at the human scored ratings and what patterns we saw within them.
Yeah, I was just thinking, trying to think, we've been using in my lab, or we're gonna start to use the CDI, the Communication Disturbance Index. That's more it's less about illogicality, more about ambiguities. But I thought it could maybe also be a good place to look for the list 6 different types of ambiguities in the discourse, and it's very specific, specifically defined in terms of anyways, I just thought that could be another idea maybe of something to look at. And Sunny, if you want, I have some data on our interaction task that I'm now allowed to share.
Oh, fantastic.
So if you want to write to me, we have 120 participants. I don't know if that's enough to be useful, but 70 LT controls and 52 patients with schizophrenia or something like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amelie. But I think they're in, are they in French?
Yes, is that a problem? Yeah.
For
Anyways,
Zak's projects right now we were only able to do English, but thank you so much, and we'll try to try to expand our capabilities to include other languages, because that's obviously a big opportunity lost, and would help our generalizability as well.
Thanks.
Are there other questions? Because I had another one, but I don't want to
I think you can continue, Amelie.
Okay, I had a question for the third speaker, I believe, like this person, not just after Sunny, but the next one, was like talking about the point 5 in your list of points to talk about today, where there was the parsing the speech into the core versus periphery elements, and I was just it's just like very naive, but I was curious of like, how do you do that? Is that something that's done like automatically, or is there some like manual coding for that, or like how do you go about like
Right, thank you for your question. There are some models, pre-trained models, that they can be used readily. So I've tried the Allen NLP pre-trained model, which I think it works well. It's I think based on BERT. There are other models that I've tried before. One of them is based on Verb Atlas, which is I think European multi-center work. They have their model available. You can send the data through the API and get the results back. The third model that I used is called, I think, Transformer SRL, which is also available. So all of these models, as input, they receive utterances, and as output, they give you all of the semantic roles tagged by like in an automated way.
Thanks. And Lina said Alban has an update, I think. Would you like
Yes.
to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have updates to share, I'll paste the email address, or I'll paste it. So please email Paulina for updates, and for if you want to give a talk in some future occurrence of this event as well. So I think that was the update, that we had some more algae project ongoing. We had a talk by Cheryl Cocorn yesterday here in Montreal, which is also really nice, and also was about language. So a lot of interesting stuff going on, but I also wanted to thank you, Sunny, for the interesting talk. And other than that, we don't have much updates currently, but more coming.
Okay, thanks. And Natalia has a question, I think.
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you, Sunny, for this brilliant talk, and all your team. I'm very impressed and very happy to see all those work going on, because one thing that I believe that it's in our track is to understand, is to make the translation of what those natural language processing markers are telling us about psychopathology, and what are the main goals in here. And in your talk, the latent factor analysis, I think that goes further on the sense. So I was wondering, I like it very much, the idea to find some like some markers that are locally and some markers that are more globally impacting sentences, or word level coherence, let me say like this, if I understood well. So I was wondering if you thought on measurements that could looking into more local phenomenon instead of global phenomena on an entire narrative, using like slider windows, or trying to distinguish markers that it's going on word level versus sentence level, or something like that, to look into those two phenomena that you found like more globally or more locally in the speech.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. I think I'm sure there are many like other strategies that we could potentially pursue based on what you're suggesting. I think that some of Yan's work touches on that a little bit. So we just used, the kind of the more consensus methods of comparing semantic similarity that Alberto published on. And you can conceptualize, I think, the utterance level semantic similarity comparisons as somewhat more global. So either, you know, adjacent utterances or skipping a second order comparisons, whereas some of the word level comparisons are maybe more local. So, you know, skipping a certain number of words and looking at it that way. And actually, in fact, it does seem to match what I theorized, you know, in terms of looking at the pragmatic theories, where the sentence level coherence was more related to inefficiency, and the word level semantic similarities was more related to incoherence. So there's some, you know, small amount of evidence to support that this might be true. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Sunny.
Yeah, thank you. Alban.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I was really interested in like trying to create new disordered speech. My first thought is, oh yeah, there's very many ways to go wrong, right? I mean, you have normal speech where we see, okay, this is normal speech, and you can go wrong in all directions. You can make errors in syntax, you can make errors like semantic content, saying like, oh, they were dancing in the rain, but it wasn't raining, stuff like that. And tenses and all this stuff. So I had it as an idea also, like retraining a model and then feeding it speech of people who have a psychosis as a training, be more similar to this, basically. I think the approach you've taken is more structural, as saying like, oh, we see these types of errors in the TLC, so we're going to train the model to be more like this, or to flip certain parts of speech to be more part of this. But I'm wondering, yeah, I tried a bit of this, but my barrier basically was there is so much heterogeneity, and it's hard to say, like, if you want to test this, right? Is this actually I mean, it's bad speech or it's wrong speech, as seen in your examples, but is it actually more similar to the speech that we see in psychosis or related to certain symptoms like that? For that, I thought, okay, you build something, you generate it, and you test it to see if it's more similar to actual patient-produced speech. But the heterogeneity sort of prevents that, in my findings. Like, you can't be, like, it's weird, okay, but it's not similar weird to this patient. But it might be similar weird to some other patients. So I was wondering, do you have thoughts about this in general? Or does anyone have thoughts about this in general?
I mean, that's the hard part, right? we're still working on that as we speak. But the decision to go with more algorithmic approaches to editing the language rather than trying to train a model for it it came down to kind of predictability and reproducibility there. There's an interesting paper out recently where they took, I think it was GPT-2 or 3, and they edited the parameters of it to shrink down the context window it has access to and raise the temperature parameter. And
this
found
is
that
Matthew Noor paper. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I think it aligned well with incoherence or something like that. So I think these generative methods could be really cool, but you need quite a bit of data to be able to train the model effectively to be able to produce text like that.
I think the other reason, yeah, as Zach said, we wanted to be able to titrate the kinds and levels of disturbance in a more like finely controlled way. But also we were going to take our generated transcripts and feed them back to blinded like human assessors to make sure that the kinds of things that we were outputting actually had, you know, the validity from a clinical perspective. The heterogeneity that you're talking about, so there's kind of different kinds of heterogeneity, like there's different kinds of disturbances that compose each, you know, concept, that each type of disturbance. So each symptom is heterogeneous in terms of like the linguistic manifestations. And then also the symptoms are heterogeneous. So like each person usually has more than one. In terms of the disturbances, like when we make our different corrections, it does disrupt more than one thing. So we're targeting something, and we try to go for the canonical disturbance that's defined from like a theoretical perspective, but it ends up disturbing other aspects of language, like as we make those corrections. So I do wonder, like, I think a soft spot in this approach is whether or not we'll end up training the fine-tuned models to look for only the kinds of disturbances that we're introducing, and that these might be different from what actually occur. But that's something that we can look at experimentally by using set aside like data sets and looking at whether or not the final product will be able to detect real world like heterogeneity and variations. I think we thought about just training the models just to be like to produce psychotic speech in general, but then it was missing, I guess. Like I felt like there was something important, because this whole talk was centered around the factors, that there's some important information there in distinguishing certainly disorganization from impoverishment and underproductivity. But I think there's something important about distinguishing between even inefficiency and incoherence as well, that this will have clinical implications down the road. So I guess we didn't think of a way to be able to do that without getting more like mechanistic and specific.
No, but even then, even if you could generate perfect psychotic speech, you might not understand it, or you might not understand what's happening in the model, so it would not further our understanding. So having like some theoretical background, or saying like, hey, this is the framework that's being used in rating scales, or that we see in patients, that's the thing that we want to change.
Yeah, we wanted to know what was going into the game pie, I guess.
Yes, I believe that it's getting deeper in the strength of the evidence that you are testing at your theory, actually. Because if you generate something based on your findings and you test it with real clinicians to distinguish between real and non-real narratives, it would be awesome. I think that it would be like deeper evidence that it's actually mimic what we are trying to understand here based on theory. Yes, at least Hollywood would love it to generate some kind of psychotic speech.
So after our paper, we'll work on a movie script to describe this journey.
Yeah, the Joker will love it.
And we have some resources in our lab.
Yeah. Oh, yes. We have a professional actor working in our lab.
Oh, great.
And screenwriter, but anyway, go ahead. Yeah. Alban, I think you said you had something else to say.
Yeah, tangentially related. I think the writer's strike in Hollywood, they just said they will never use AI tools for writing scripts or movies. So I think the idea is out. Like you can't, you have to make it very clear that you didn't actually write it, or the studio. But okay, sorry, I'll continue. Let the science continue. Sorry.
Do we have another question?
So I could have one then. So you had a multiple groups of diagnosis that you used in your samples. I was also wondering, have you tried looking at speech characteristics and generating those for example, depression, or a more bipolar type of disorder? They have different speech characteristics. It might be in some way easier to tackle as a problem, because in schizophrenia there's such a heterogeneity in symptoms and in things that can go wrong. I can imagine, for example, in depression, that if you increase you change stuff like referring to people more to the person itself, I, me, and stuff like that, that you might get like a stronger or easier something that works and something that you can compare with, and the data sets might be larger as well. This goes a bit away from psychosis, perhaps, but you would catch perhaps the negative symptoms with stuff like this.
Yeah, Zach or me? No, we didn't try that. That's actually, we went for the high hanging fruit, I guess, this time. Just, I think, because of my personal interest in psychosis. But that's a really good point, that perhaps depression and also mania could be modeled more simply and directly. And I think in terms of the generation or the kinds of modifications you would give to speech, LLMs might be useful, but some even simpler methods would help as well. Yeah.
I can continue on if there are no more questions. I can ask one more if.
Yeah.
So continuing on with the point that Lena made earlier, like different stages of the illness. So in acute illness, you might see much more factors, more symptoms, more heterogeneity, and you have sort of like a state viewpoint, and then in more remitted patients or more chronic patients, whichever you prefer, there is more of the negative factor, for example, it's much larger. And it's seen much more as like, oh, this is the foundation, so to say. So we're looking at now like at different time slices of patients. So you might have a patient that is acute or first episode or schizophrenic, and then these people are clumped together, and we say, oh, these are the factors that we should look at. I think that's the data that we have, but I think we should be a bit careful to say like, oh, this is psychosis in general. Because the psychosis state is also differs over time, and some people, if they have florid psychosis, they might have very different factor loadings, or like even how you would classify their speech, how many different aspects are you going to measure? If you're going to just say, oh, or the other way around, so someone that has a very strong, incoherence compound, but they're also depressed. The depressed part is going to be lost. Basically, it's going to be subsumed in the incoherence part. So, oh, there was some, like it's easier to group it under that, from a clinical perspective at least.
Yeah.
And then you're going to miss these factors that might be present in like the average. But I guess the question is like, is there such a thing as schizophrenic speech in general? That's why we have groups. I don't even know if this is a question or more like a general musing part. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. I don't think there's one schizophrenic speech entity. I think that's partly why I wanted to look at these latent factors, because like clearly there's a great deal of heterogeneity, and looking at these latent dimensions is one way of thinking about the heterogeneity. So there are people, chronic people, who might be higher on one factor than others, and the amount to which different speech disturbances are present may be different across different factors and different stages of illness, and et cetera. But I would like to think that it's, right now, of course, these are kind of statistical type entities that we're trying to construct. But I wonder, I hope that there's some underlying like biological or psychological truth to some of these, where it's right now it's just conjecture, but I think that there's some way of characterizing symptoms that relate to actual underlying like neurobiological disturbances, where certain kinds of disturbances or disturbances in certain pathways lead to impaired expressivity versus incoherence versus inefficiency. And I think that again, I know that it's outside of the evidence that we've been presenting so far, but Frederica, for her factors, which are very much mirror ours, she found distinct neurobiological signatures on MRI at least, and I think maybe Lena has found differences between disorganization and other kinds of thought disorder, I believe, and so if you think about it as like actual biological entities, then there may be differences in terms of prevalence, like which kinds of disturbance is stronger at what phase of illness. But I don't think that the boundaries shouldn't blur, because you might have more than one, but but it's still a real thing in itself, that where like, if you disturb this part of the brain, you're just going to get this kind of like range of symptoms out of it. So yeah, so statistically, like certainly there could be fragmentations of factors and whatnot, but hopefully there's something real underlying this understanding. Anyway, yeah, I have another question.
Yeah, Manu?
Hi, I'm just going to extend Albin's thought a little bit more and think through from a clinical standpoint. So we oftentimes end up with the chicken and the egg problem, right? Which comes first? If we start with DSM-based diagnostic categories, we know there's no mapping onto biology. And if we start with a heterogeneous sample, then we are left with the heterogeneity and we don't know what explains what. I think the way I think about the solution can be like we can kind of learn from other specialties in medicine and just focus on what does the long-term clinical trajectory look like based on these factors, right? Instead of getting stuck with, okay, fine, is this schizophrenia, is this schizoaffective, is this bipolar, is it depression? We know these are like agreed upon constructs, right? But they might not map onto biology as cleanly as we would want them from a research standpoint. But where they can actually truly make clinical impact is, okay, fine, someone who comes in with, for example, the semantic coherence index of such and such, right? And we follow them through a period of time and see how they're how they respond differently to antipsychotics, what kind of interventions are working, what's not working. I think that'll be the key where we'll think through, okay, fine, we have an HbA1c like value for psychiatric illnesses, where we know anything more than 6 has resulted in bad outcomes, whereas less than 6 might be better outcomes. Because inherently HbA1c is not telling us anything about diabetes, right? It's just telling us what's the long-term prognosis. Same thing with blood pressure, same thing with cardiovascular risk factors, right? So if we can come up with a risk factor stratification based on language samples and look through prognosis, I think that could help us answer a more clinically meaningful answer for now. And then once we have enough data, I think biology will present itself, hopefully. Or it might or it might not, right? Who knows? Yeah. But the idea is like that's how I think we can solve the problem, by asking a different set of questions.
Or simultaneously asking both
exactly,
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
I wanted to
you
just
have
a little bit on this. Yeah, it's on the same idea, but looking at another perspective, looking at the social part of these paradigms that we are applying. You mentioned it that several times that in your protocol, picture descriptions are some of the best ways to look into those markers. And I was wondering if what do you think about, because those are kind of monologues, but for when you have a picture on the basis, you can understand what is this topic to be talked about. So emotions, expressions of emotions, and signs of social cognition. Do you think on this, on your protocols, and how this could add to have more variability on your data and to look into things that talks with psychopathology?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're asking about dialogue, really, right? Like conversations, and yeah, no, I think that could potentially be very valuable. Actually, Albin mentioned Cheryl Corcoran's talk yesterday. I don't know if any of you else, any of the rest of you were there, but I attended virtually. And she mentioned that that's her main form of data collection, was like unstructured, really, conversations. And no, I think that could potentially be very rich, and could really get at like social processing differences, which, spoken differently, I think you can also understand that as like differences in linguistically as like deixis, and like deictic kind of like changes and constructs, and the changes in the deictic space in conversations. And yeah, no, I think that could be extremely relevant. We haven't done that so far because I think we've traded off like consistency and standardization, which works better for these more monologue type tasks, because as Cheryl actually mentioned, in psychosis as well as what we've seen previously in autism, when the participant displays a certain kind of like disruption to their speech and language, the interviewer can often mirror it or synchronize to the ways that the participant, shows changes. And so it's, I think if we look at it just as like one whole phenomenon and just forget trying to isolate the participant from, what happens with the interviewer, I think that might be a great way to approach it.
Exactly. We can lose kind of controlled setting, but we gain the ecological validity and to understand the real goal here. And adding to Manu's ideas, I love it, because sometimes we are just attached to a previous way to think about disorders and how we communicate to each other. But if we get deeper into this, the brain, it's like a learning machine. And sometimes we're just learning how to act and how to behave and communicate with each other. So this, as a monologue, it's like reading the reality and trying to translate this reality to an inner space. But in a dialogue, it's a little bit trickier, because you're trying to attach with another mind. So it's another level of to understanding what it's those shared reality. It's not only your reality inside, it's the shared reality and how you communicate this different kinds of perspective. Sometimes if you are just pressed, you can have impaired reality checking. And sometimes if you are psychotic, you could be creating another reality that could not be shared. So I think that this transdiagnostic point of view in the dialogue could be nice to look at. But we need to, I can see both strategies that has a lot of values if we go into this direction that I see that you have it, like trying to understand what those markers are telling us about communication, and not only pulling out measurements to be attached to our previous views, but trying to move forward to understand how it's related to our communication and how it's reliable, and how can we generalize it to other cultures and other settings.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. That's a really good point.
Brian?
Yeah, I think, sorry for coming in late here, but the same issue comes up with the study of aphasia a lot. The trade-off between sort of a open, person-centered communication versus, getting systematic data in the same form. And I think the answer is, of course, you really want both, not surprisingly, but there's a really rich literature on particularly the open dialogue and the person-centered, Now, of course, it's going to be different. I mean, psychosis is different from aphasia. I mean, I'm not trying to say that, but the methodology issue has been really worked up a lot over in that area. Yeah.
That's great. I wonder if we might even hypothesize that there would be that expanding to dialogue would open up even more variability in psychosis than in aphasia, because there's more of an association in the disorder with social.
I think it is different. The trick in aphasia is often the lag between responding. You have to give people time because they're having troubles formulating. I mean, we also have this also with dementia. Which is yet another, thing we haven't talked about. But right, no, it's obviously different, but the consideration is the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think time is up. If you don't have any other question, I want to thank again Sunny and her crew for these great presentations. And as you know, our next seminar in next month, it will be with Dr. Roberto Limongi. And sorry for my pronunciation.
No, it's great.
And yeah, thanks, Sunny.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Che. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
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 See you.